Starmer has done the right thing. As you say, he's grasped the nettle. But, this is just the start of it, James. Because the second thing he has to do is probably get onto the chairman of BAE Systems and say, I need another 48 Typhoons, and I need more frigates, I need more submarines, because, we now have to rearm. The world's changed last week. Yeah. And the one thing...
You've done... You know what you've done? You've pressed 1 and 2 on my switchboard. You've pressed 1 for overthinking and you've pressed 2 for just thinking, because you've gone immediately into the much broader ramifications of what's on the table here, which is probably inevitable, but beyond the simple wisdom or otherwise of Starmer committing UK troops. I think you're right, for what it's worth. I think the world has changed in the last week.
Well, I think James, what he has to do is then get on to Macron and Scholz and just say, are you following suit?
Mm. That's exactly what's happening. That is. Yeah. I mean, certainly as it's being reported today, and the timbre of Starmer's piece in the Telegraph is very much that I am going to Paris, and Macron, we know, is already on side to urge other European leaders to follow my lead, especially, as you identify, Alan, a historically reluctant Germany. This is a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine.
I think we have to send a message to Trump and say this is our continent, because the one thing that odious man is right about, the only thing,
yes,
is that we haven't spent enough on defence.
Yes.
And as a Labour man, I think you recognise my voice, James, is Keir Starmer has been left a black hole of neglect of our armed forces. We are pitiful. I mean, I think we've probably got below 80,000 troops, and if you put troops on the ground, there's all the logistics to back them up. There's probably the armoured personnel carried. There's the helicopters, and probably people are running around Whitehall now with the MOD saying, right, what do we need? Are we going to send the paratroops? Are we going to send the Marines? Are we going to send this? Have we got them? Have we got the troops? And because we...
Well, I mean, there's a million different questions here, isn't there? Yeah. I mean, have we got the military capability to do X is not the same question as have we got the military capability to do Y. So in the first instance, putting troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of, I don't think he'd act unilaterally, but as part of a European peacekeeping force, we have the wherewithal to do that. In the context of the new threat, that the absolute disappearance of Fukuyama's claim that history had ended, that liberal democracy had proved so successful against totalitarian ideological rivals that we don't need to worry anymore about. That is categorically over, and that's the next stage of the conversation. That's the question of whether or not a population that's not under attack can be persuaded that it needs to spend more money on defence against a currently non-existent attack. And as you know, historically, that's a very tricky thing to do.
I would just like to mention the fact that you had peacekeeping forces on the streets of the north of Ireland, and the only thing it resulted in was walls, and more walls, which still stand today. So to me, I think it's a bit preemptive of Keir Starmer to go in as leading this charge. It should be more of a European coalition around this issue.
I think perhaps I haven't explained it very well. He definitely would not be doing anything unilaterally. It did categorically. I mean, Macron is already fairly on board with this. The key stumbling point would be Germany, Olaf Scholz. But it would be a European peacekeeping force, not by any stretch of the imagination a uniquely British one.
And does this not just place then a European peacekeeping force in between Russia and Ukraine for Russia to then goad them into some sort of wider conflict?
Well, no, I don't think it does. But of course, you never say never. But what would the alternative be?
Well, I don't see an alternative to this situation until you've got a military that's at least coalescing around one single issue.
That's what Starmer's trying to do today. The alternative I meant was what do you do to Russia if not this?
Well, I would say every country being able to at least guarantee a certain percentage of their military spend towards Ukraine.
Again, you're a bit further ahead of me. I'm talking about on the ground in Ukraine today. If this is not policy for European allies, then what is? With regard to the message Putin is being sent, having mounted an illegal invasion of Ukraine. You've got a man in the White House now saying, I don't think Ukraine should have got involved in this war, as if they somehow elected to get invaded by Vladimir Putin.
No, of course they didn't.
Or did something wrong by resisting. So in the context, I don't want to sound like I'm badgering you, but I want to be absolutely clear that you know what question I'm asking. In the context of European policy towards this war today, what's the option, if not this?
I don't see it as the only option that needs to be taken.
Good. So
sure.
what are the other ones?
I mean, from my side, I would say just more of a coming together across Europe to be able to hash out a plan. Do you know what I mean? I understand that you've got Putin
I don't know what you mean. I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean more of the people across Europe coming together to hash out a plan. I genuinely don't know what that means.
It's fine by me.
Huh?
It's fine by me. I'm just trying to say that there is obviously a peril when you start to put forces in an active conflict. I
don't want to lecture you on the history of the north of Ireland, but the exact quote of the British Army's role was to support the RUC in the defeat of terrorism, which is about 465 million miles away from a peacekeeping role on the ground in Ukraine today.
No, of course there are different places historically for sure.
I'm definitely in the camp of overthinking. I'm going to warn you. I'm one of the world's biggest overthinkers. So in response to your question, I've overthought all of this. As you can imagine, it keeps me awake at night, and events of the last couple of weeks have given me nightmares, to be quite honest.
I'm sure.
The short answer is, in my heart, I would love to see anything that brings us about a security guarantee for Ukraine for the future. And if that entails peacekeeping forces, NATO forces, and therefore by extension British forces on the ground in Ukraine, in my heart, my Ukrainian heart, I'm British, but my heart and soul is in Ukraine, I want to say this is a good thing. However, events of the last 2 weeks and knowing how Putin operates and understanding as well from being in Ukraine just how long this conflict has been going on for, this conflict did not start in February 22. And it didn't start when Russia invaded Crimea either. This is a centuries-old conflict. And we will be embroiling ourselves in a situation that I fear could escalate rapidly. And secondly, I fear that we are walking into a trap of Putin's making. And by that, I mean that Putin, the Russians, on the battlefield, we like to think of them in Ukraine as being quite stupid, quite backward. Their equipment is degraded. Their troops are inexperienced and poorly equipped and poorly trained. But on a global geopolitical level, the Russians have been playing a game of 5D chess for a very long time. And as you said earlier, we've been at war for a very long time. We just don't know it. We just don't realise it.
I do think that's true.
And I think that the peace talks that are taken, they're not peace talks, they're surrender talks, by the way.
Well, they can't be surrender talks because Ukraine's not there. I had to double check that. I thought I'd misremembered. Yeah. So they're going to Saudi Arabia. The United States and Russia are going to Saudi Arabia to have peace talks about a war in Ukraine that Ukraine is not party to.
Exactly. And so we've got a situation where we're not talking about appeasement. I believe this is alignment on Trump's part, not appeasement. It's alignment. It's very different to Chamberlain. And I think that we've got a situation where we've got Putin playing 5D chess against the chimpanzee on the other side of the board.
Okay. I understand where you're coming from. Shashank Joshi is someone I often turn to in these moments, defense editor at The Economist. And he... makes the point that the actual deployment would not be like we are used to seeing in Europe. It would be a reassurance force to the rear, not at the front, and not at all like NATO battle groups in Eastern Europe. That's option one. And option two would be a peacekeeping type force at the post-ceasefire line of contact. So, I mean, the idea that British troops are going to arrive and head straight towards the front line and start killing Russians is not on the table.
Okay, that's good to know. That idea.
I think that's important. Go on.
My concern of us being walked into a trap, and the reason I referenced the fact that this war has been going on for centuries, is the fact that the Russians have a playbook. We know what it is now. They've shown it to us several times. They've done it in the Donbass, where for years we've been hearing about Ukrainian separatists, when in fact they're actually Chechen troops that they've bussed in to wreak havoc in those regions. In Crimea, remember the little green men that were clearly Russian soldiers, murdering people and causing mayhem in Crimea. And the Russians point blank looked down the camera and said they don't belong to us when they were clearly Russian troops. What we're going to see in Ukraine is if we don't see a withdrawal to internationally recognised borders, i.e. Russia withdraws to Russia and Ukraine restores its territory back, what we're going to see is a continuation of those tactics. We're going to see little green men in those border regions. We're going to see false flag operations by the Russians causing mayhem.
All of which is relevant and pertinent, but not actually reasons not to do the right thing. And the right thing, surely,
the right thing in the right context.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's keen to be clear about what is on the table and what is not. So, a peacekeeping force in Europe to protect the parameters of any peace deal, or to sort of be around the back of the Ukrainian forces as a sort of bulwark or as a form of security, a reassurance force, if you like, to the rear, are not, I don't think, risking some of the things you fear.
I think the idea of a beefed up military and a European defence identity, as they sort of call it, would be a great thing. But at the same time, under current circumstances, I would be mortified if we put British troops into Ukraine, just because after 3 years of this war, which is a war that no NATO nation has participated in anything like this for decades, this kind of attritional, almost First World War trench warfare and artillery, and no NATO countries fought that. We've been largely fighting in the Middle East, where it's all about fast manoeuvre and taking key places very quickly. We've had massive superiority in terms of air cover and that kind of thing. We haven't faced anything like this. And
so these are logistical concerns, but and they're valid. I sense that you've probably got some military experience yourself if you're going to be if you're taking this perspective.
Or security services, but we spoke before. My dad did a lot of work with NATO for years and years. Yeah. So and the idea of a European defence identity is not new. I mean, back when Willy Brandt was German Chancellor and Heath was Prime Minister, and I forget who was the French. It wasn't Mitterrand, but they suggested that Europe should rely less on American troops and American bases and build this European defence identity, and the US quashed that because they wanted to carry on having an influence, because when NATO was created, behind the scenes, it wasn't the sort of publicly stated purpose, but it was always said that the purpose of NATO was to keep America in, Russia out, and Germany down. That was the phrase always deployed. And that's changing now.
It's changing as we watch. It's changing in real time. It's why the first caller talked about the world changing last week in a way that people haven't fully caught up with. All I'd counter your point with is that analysis from the defence editor of The Economist talking about what is actually being proposed, and neither of which at the moment involves what you fear, and what you almost certainly rightly describe as being something we wouldn't be very well equipped to provide. So it's a reassurance force to the rear, nothing like NATO battle groups in Eastern Europe, or a peacekeeping type force at the post-ceasefire lines of contact. So possibly, to go back to Elsie in Brussels, that there would be walls, so to speak, but I say walls, you say borders, and one sounds good, one sounds bad. So I don't know that the fears you have are on the table yet.
My worry is it would be more like what's referred to as a tripwire force, where, because we've already had, whether we don't openly say so, but we've already had troops in Ukraine, and we've lost troops in Ukraine. We've had SAS and SBS killed. We've had commandos killed over there, and a lot of them died in Lviv when a training centre where we were training Ukrainian officers was attacked and annihilated, destroyed by the Russians very early on in the war.